Just as I lifted my fork ready to take the first bite of my Sunday roast, my grandson shouted across the table, "Grandma, don't eat that." The words cracked the air like lightning. Everyone froze. Even the steam rising from my chicken seemed to hesitate. Craig, my eldest son, looked up from his wine, eyes wide with confusion. Brenna, his new wife, with her polished smile and glassy charm, paused mid-sentence. Her lips twitched, not quite in surprise, more like calculation. I looked down at my plate. Cornbread, collard greens, roast chicken, my usual spread, the same I'd made for decades. But something felt off. Not in the food itself, but in the way Milo's eyes locked onto it. He was pale, quiet hands trembling slightly near his juice glass. I knew that look. A child's fear doesn't lie. So I smiled gently at him as if to reassure us both. "How about we swap, sweetheart?" Before anyone could object, I reached across the table, lifted my plate, and slid it in front of Brenna, trading with hers. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. That more than anything confirmed my suspicion. She took a bite. Conversation resumed for a moment. Glasses clinked. Marissa giggled at something on her phone. Craig made an offhand joke about Iowa winters. I sat there, quiet, observing, my fork untouched, my eyes shifting between Brenna and Milo. And then, like the slow crack of ice on a frozen pond, it happened. Brenna's complexion drained of color. Her lips turned a shade too pale. Her hands trembled as she reached for her water, and then she collapsed abruptly, gracelessly onto the hardwood floor. The wine glass shattered beside her. Craig shot up, knocking his chair backward. Marissa screamed. Milo dropped his spoon, eyes wide with terror. But I didn't move. Not out of shock, not out of fear, but because deep down I already knew. Someone had tried to get rid of me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No threats, no confrontations. Just quiet arrangements, papers slipped into conversation, suggestions about healthcare and better living options. But now it had escalated, and somehow they thought they'd get away with it. I had spent 42 years as a librarian, filing facts, tracing details, learning that the truth rarely shouts, it whispers, in footnotes, in small shifts of behavior, in a child's eyes during dinner. The paramedics arrived swiftly, weaving through the chaos. Everyone was talking over one another, voices rising in panic. Craig insisted she must have had a bad reaction. Marissa was crying now. And Milo. He sat frozen, eyes still on me. I didn't say a word. I just stood and placed my napkin beside my plate. Then I slipped on my coat, the familiar wool brushing against my arms. No one stopped me. Craig didn't even look up. The night air greeted me with its usual chill. Late March in Cedar Falls had a bite to it. My breath clouded the air as I stepped off the porch. Snowmelt soaked into my shoes, but I hardly noticed. The porch light above flickered as it always did, casting long shadows onto the damp pavement. And in that quiet space, away from the noise and accusation, I let the truth settle. They had underestimated me. I was old, yes, but I wasn't blind or foolish, and I certainly wasn't ready to be erased. I slipped into the driver's seat of my car. The leather was cold against my back, the silence inside louder than the chaos behind me. For a long moment, I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel. Then, without thinking, I spoke out loud, my voice low and steady. "I hope you enjoyed your plate, dear." It wasn't anger. It wasn't even bitterness. It was clarity. That night had revealed more than an attempted betrayal. It had shown me who still saw me as human and who didn't. Milo had screamed. And because of that, I was still here. One dinner, one scream, one small act of courage. And now? Now it was my turn. Not to retaliate with fire or fury, but to remember, to gather, to prepare. Because justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with gloved hands and sharp memory. And this time justice would speak through me. The next morning I found myself sitting at the old kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. The sun filtered through the curtains in soft bands, illuminating the dust that danced in the quiet air. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and yesterday's roast. Everything around me felt still, except my memory. I closed my eyes. And there I was, 36 years old again, apron stained with flour, a toddler clinging to my leg, and the oven timer blaring over the soft crackle of the radio. Cray had always loved cornbread. He'd sit at this very table, swinging his legs, watching me mix the batter like it was magic. I'd tell him stories about dragons that loved libraries or mice who ran bookstores, and he'd laugh until milk came out of his nose. Back then, it was just him and me. We didn't have much. A used sedan one-bedroom we shared and a battered card catalog of overdue bills. I worked double shifts at the city library and graded GED papers at night. But we had our routines. I remember ironing his school shirts at midnight, quietly folding the sleeves just so hoping he'd feel loved even when I wasn't there to kiss him goodbye in the mornings. Sacrifice was a quiet thing. No one clapped for it. No one noticed it. But it built the foundation of our life. I opened my eyes again and looked at the chipped edge of the table, same as it had always been. I had never refinished it, never sanded away the memory of little fingers tapping excitedly for just one more story. And then Craig had grown. He got taller than me. His voice deepened. He started calling me Mom instead of Mama. The first time he didn't kiss my cheek before school, I stood by the door 10 minutes after it closed, wondering if I had done something wrong. Years passed. I watched him become a man. I helped him with college applications, ironed his interview suit, and cried alone the day he got engaged the first time. Not because I wasn't happy for him, goodness I was, but because it was the first time I truly felt like a chapter was closing. My boy was becoming someone else's priority. Still, I smiled. I supported him. I hosted their showers, baked their cakes, even when they forgot to say thank you. Because that's what mothers do. We love. Even when we're edited out of the photo. And now, after everything after last night, I sat in that same kitchen with the same worn chair creaking beneath me, trying to understand how a child I had poured my life into could stand by as someone tried to erase me. I reached for the wooden drawer beside the sink, the one that stuck halfway, if you didn't pull it just right. Inside, tucked beneath a yellowed stack of unused coupons and brittle birthday cards, was a bundle of letters tied with green ribbon. The paper had faded at the edges, the ink bled slightly from time and air. Judy's handwriting stared back at me, slanted, confident, always with blue ink. She used to say black was too final, too formal. Write like you're still becoming, she told me once, over lukewarm cider and banana bread. I ran my thumb along the top envelope. The flap was unbroken. The note on the front in her unmistakable hand read, "Open only when it matters." She'd mailed it 5 years ago. A month before the stroke that silenced her. A month before the funeral where I couldn't bring myself to speak. Back then, I thought the ache of losing her would fade. That grief would wash over me and move on like a passing storm. But I was wrong. Grief didn't pass, it settled. Quiet and permanent like dust in the corners of this house. I'd kept that envelope tucked away untouched. Not because I forgot it was there, but because I remembered too well. I told myself I wasn't ready. That maybe I never would be. Judy always saw what others missed. She saw through my forced smiles. She heard what I didn't say, especially on the nights Craig stopped calling or when the house felt too big for one. She had been there through the cracks, the failed mortgage negotiation, the loneliness after Harold left the morning I found my father's watch missing from the drawer and pretended not to notice. She had been my mirror, my anchor, and now she was just ink and paper. The day she gave me that envelope, we sat on the back porch. It was late fall and the leaves clung to the trees like they weren't ready either. She handed it to me with no ceremony, no explanation, just a long look and a squeeze of my wrist. When you feel like you're slipping through cracks no one else can see, that's when. I didn't ask what she meant. I never had to. That was Judy. And now, here I was, staring at my reflection in the stainless steel of the sink, feeling more like a shadow than a person. My son had looked past me last night. His wife nearly killed me. My name had become a technicality in my own home. I held the envelope to my chest and closed my eyes. Was this the moment? I waited for something inside me to decide. A yes, a break, a shift. But all I heard was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint ache of something unfinished. Not yet, I whispered. But soon, with careful hands, I slid the envelope back into the drawer. Once it opened, there'd be no way to unread what she'd written. Craig called the next morning, not to check on how I was feeling, not to ask if I'd slept. Just 4 words delivered flat and polite. "Can you come over?" His tone said it wasn't a request. I drove there in silence. The roads were still damp from early rain and the sky hung low with pale gray clouds. I parked on their pristine driveway lined with decorative stones and solar lights that hadn't worked in years. Inside, the air smelled like lemon disinfectant and expensive candles. Too clean, too curated, nothing like home. Craig stood in the kitchen, arms crossed. Brenna sat at the table, her arm bandaged, a mug of tea cupped loosely in her hands. Milo wasn't there. Neither was Marissa. "Mom," Craig began, not looking at me. "We need to talk." I nodded, waiting. He cleared his throat. "What happened last night was disturbing." Brenna didn't speak, but she looked at me, calm, distant. That same real estate smile without the warmth, the kind that said she'd already decided what the truth was. "I'm just trying to understand," Craig continued. "Why did Milo scream like that? Why did you switch the plates?" "I trusted my instincts," I said quietly. Milo seemed frightened. Craig blinked. "So you thought Brenna poisoned your dinner?" "I didn't say that. But that's what you implied." I swallowed. The kitchen suddenly felt too bright. The white countertops, the gleaming appliances, they all seemed to glare. Brenna finally spoke. "Maybe she just got confused," she said lightly. "It happens, especially at that age." That age? I let the words settle. They didn't land like a blow. They settled like sediment. Heavy. Dirty. "Brenna," I said, "I'm not confused." She shrugged. "Of course not. But still, maybe it's time we think about next steps." Craig didn't interrupt her. That stung more than the words themselves. I turned to him. "Next steps?" "A facility," she offered. "Somewhere safe, where she's monitored. We can't risk another scare." The word scare rolled off her tongue like I was a gas leak or a faulty fuse. Craig rubbed his temple. "Let's not jump to—" "She's getting older, Craig." And this was serious. I looked at my son, the boy I raised on library floors and boxed dinners. He wouldn't meet my eyes. In that moment, I felt it. Not anger, not yet. Just a hollow settling in my chest. A quiet realization I was no longer someone to be protected. I was someone to be managed. I stood there in that kitchen, surrounded by polished stone and filtered light, and felt like a forgotten photograph. Still present, but no longer framed. So I said nothing, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any accusation. Back home, I stood in the entryway for a long time, coat still on, purse dangling from my shoulder. The house was too quiet, as if it knew I'd come back changed. I tried to remember why I'd gone to Craig's in the first place. "Oh, right," he called. But the moment I let the door close behind me, doubt began to whisper. Not loudly, not cruelly, just consistently. Had I overreacted? Was I truly confused, as Brenna put it? I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stared at the grocery list I'd left taped to the fridge. Flour, apricots, baking soda, items I had written down but now couldn't remember needing. I opened the fridge. The same cornbread from Sunday sat untouched. A single slice missing. No one else had eaten. The kettle still had water from yesterday. I turned it on anyway. As steam built and the whistle grew sharp, I sat at the table and stared at my hands. They looked the same as they always had. The same age spots, the same bent knuckle from where I slammed a drawer 30 years ago. But today they trembled just a little. That was new. Or maybe I had ignored it before. My eyes drifted to the hallway, to the mirror by the coat closet. I stood and walked toward it slowly, as if something about my reflection might offer answers, might reassure me. I looked tired. More than tired. My face wore the kind of weariness that no sleep could fix. It wasn't illness. It wasn't sadness. It was invisibility. I pressed a hand against the glass. Cold. A memory flickered Milo's eyes the night before, wide and terrified. Not of me, but for me. That mattered. I clung to that. He had seen something. He had acted. And that instinct, his scream, was real. Children don't lie with their eyes. But still the voices echoed. Maybe she just got confused. She's getting older. Next steps. I heard them as I walked through the house, passing rooms filled with things I had collected over a lifetime. The clock I bought after Harold left. The bookshelf Judy helped me build. The apron Craig painted for me in second grade, still hanging, still clean. Each object had a story. Each one tethered me to who I was. But now those stories felt like echoes in a room where no one was listening. I returned to the kitchen, poured myself tea, and added a spoonful of honey. Then I stared at it untouched, cooling fast. I had spent decades building a life, a family, a home full of warmth and memory. And now I was being told I no longer belonged in it. That may be. I had imagined the cracks forming beneath me. I took a breath. Then another, and told myself what I had always told Craig as a boy when he was scared, when he was small. You remember what matters. Even if no one else does. The next morning, I walked into Cedar Falls Bank and Trust. It was the same place I'd gone for over 30 years. Same stone facade, same old chime at the door, same smell of floor polish and faint lavender air freshener from the front counter. Lisa, the teller, looked up and smiled with her usual warmth. "Morning, Evelyn. What brings you in today?" "I need to look at my statements," I said, "from the past 3 months." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she nodded. Of course. Savings or checking? Both. She typed quickly, her acrylic nails tapping against the keyboard in a rhythm that reminded me of rain against my roof. After a moment, she frowned. "I'll just print these out for you." "One moment." I stood at the counter, hands folded tightly, feeling the edge of my gloves dig into my skin. The lobby was quiet, only the muffled sound of a copier behind the glass. Lisa returned her smile, more careful now. "I printed the summary and details," she said. "Let me know if anything looks off." I thanked her and stepped to the side to read. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Grocery store, pharmacy, utility bills. But then I saw it. A withdrawal for $43,000, labeled Transfer to Joint Investment Account, Evelyn Polk. Dated 2 weeks ago. I felt my chest tighten. There was no joint investment account. Not in my name. Not with my permission. I flipped the page. There was a printed signature beneath the transaction. My name. Neat, controlled, almost too perfect. But not mine. My hands had written that name hundreds of times on birthday cards, checks, even Milo's school forms. I knew how my P looped just slightly, how the K at the end leaned right when I was tired. This one was practiced, but it wasn't me. My fingers began to tremble. I pressed them against the counter to stop the shaking. Lisa looked over. "Something wrong?" I opened my mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I didn't authorize this," I said. "This isn't my signature." She leaned in, concerned. "You're sure?" I gave her a look. She nodded. "I'll escalate this. We have procedures. It might take a few days, but we'll get to the bottom of it." I nodded, trying to focus on my breath. In, out. She handed me the original printout. "You keep this copy. And Evelyn." "Yes. Check your prescriptions too. Just in case." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. As I stepped out of the bank, the cold air hit harder than expected. I didn't zip my coat. I didn't even feel the wind. All I felt was that paper in my hand. Smooth, official, and wrong. Sicious Anling, gone. Signed away by someone who thought I wouldn't notice. Someone who thought I was slipping. Someone who assumed I wouldn't remember what was mine. The wind was still sharp when I reached the pharmacy. Bell's drugstore had been there longer than most buildings in town. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked and the display of holiday cards always stood one season behind. The smell inside camphor floor wax and peppermint gum was oddly comforting. I walked up to the counter where Maria usually stood. Today it was Dr. Alvarez, mid-50s, gentle voice, reading glasses low on his nose. He'd filled my prescriptions for over a decade. "Good morning, Mrs. Polk," he said. "You need a refill." "Actually," I replied, pulling the paper from my coat pocket, "I need to check something." He adjusted his glasses and took the slip. I leaned in. "Have there been any new prescriptions filled under my name in the last month?" "Ones I didn't pick up." He glanced at the screen, then paused. "Give me one moment." I watched his brow furrow as he clicked through the records. The silence stretched. Then he looked up slow and careful. There was one, he said. A refill for lorazepam. I frowned. I don't take lorazepam. That's what I thought. You've never had anything in the benzodiazepine family. He turned the screen slightly toward me. It was filled here 2 weeks ago, called in under Dr. Harlan. I shook my head. I don't know that name. It's not your usual doctor. Not from Cedar Falls at all. It says Chicago. Chicago, I echoed. He nodded, tapping the desk gently. It was picked up by someone who signed for it, under your name. He handed me a printed copy of the record. There it was, my name, again. Same signature. Too neat, too smooth. A little slanted to the right. I held the paper tighter than I meant to. What exactly is lorazepam for? I asked. Primarily for anxiety, he said. Also prescribed for agitation sleep disorders. It's sedative. Strong. I blinked slowly, trying to process it. Would it be dangerous? Mixed with alcohol? His eyes met mine. Yes, he said carefully. Very. I looked down at the printout again. 2 weeks ago, around the same time as the dinner, around the same time $43,000 vanished from my account. A slow chill crept up my spine, colder than the wind outside. They weren't just trying to make me doubt myself. They were planning something far more permanent. I took a breath, steadying my voice. Can I have a copy of this? Of course. He pressed print. The machine hummed, then clicked. The paper came out warm, too clean for what it held. He handed it to me with both hands. Evelyn, he said softly, do you have someone to talk to? I nodded slowly, folding the paper into my coat pocket. But the truth was, I didn't. Not really. Just a frightened boy who still looked at me like I mattered. And a drawer full of letters from a friend who saw this coming before I ever did. I rang the doorbell. The sound echoed longer than it should have. I waited, gripping the folded prescription record in my coat pocket like it was the last piece of solid ground under my feet. Craig opened the door. He looked tired, a little annoyed. Mom, he said, surprised, but not warmly. You should have called. I need to talk. He hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside the house was quiet. Too quiet. No smell of dinner, no soft music from the kitchen, just silence and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Marissa sat on the couch, eyes on her phone. She glanced up, then quickly back down. Where's Brenna? I asked. Craig shrugged. Resting. Still recovering. From what I wondered but didn't ask. I sat down in the chair across from him. He stayed standing. I went to the bank, I said. His expression barely changed. There was a withdrawal, $43,000, from a joint account I don't have, and a signature that isn't mine. He rubbed the back of his neck, not meeting my eyes. I don't know anything about that. I nodded once. I also checked the pharmacy. A sedative was filled under my name. I never take those, never have, but it was picked up, signed for. Mom, he interrupted, voice sharp. What exactly are you accusing us of? I looked up at him slowly. I'm not accusing, I said. I'm remembering. For a long second, no one spoke. Then Craig muttered, You're being paranoid. Maybe you forgot. These things happen. There it was again, that word. Forgot. As if my memory were a cracked glass ready to split open at any time. I stood, suddenly unable to stay in that chair. You know me better than that, Craig. He didn't answer. Marissa shifted uncomfortably on the couch, but still said nothing. I walked toward the hallway as if I were still welcome here. I passed the family photos on the wall frames I once bought, faces I helped raise. I stopped at the last one, a Christmas photo from 3 years ago. I wasn't in it. They had taken it during a trip I wasn't invited on. A lump rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Just then, small footsteps padded behind me. Milo. He didn't say anything. He just reached up and slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. I knelt down. What's this, sweetheart? He shrugged, eyes darting back toward the living room. It's just a picture. From school. Then he turned and hurried off before Craig could notice. I unfolded it. Crayon lines. Bold shapes. A table. A woman with gray hair sitting at one end. A plate in front of her. A red X across it. And next to her, another woman slumped in her chair. Underneath he'd written in shaky print I saw. My breath caught. The colors were messy, the proportions off, but the meaning was clear. He remembered too, and somehow that made all the difference. Back home, I unfolded Milo's drawing again and laid it on the kitchen table. The paper curled slightly at the edges, soft from his small hands. I traced the crayon lines with my fingertip red, blue, green, and paused at the words he had written I saw. Children don't lie like adults do. They don't have the training, or the reasons. What they see, they remember. What they feel, they speak. And somewhere between the messy scribbles and two big letters, I felt something I hadn't touched in days. Anchor. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into the back of a cookery book no one ever borrowed, the kind with grease, stains, and worn corners. I tucked it deep between pages on holiday ham glazes and molasses cake. Then I sat at the table with the bank statement and the pharmacy printout beside me. Both pages were crisp, official, sanitized almost, the kind of paper that carries authority just by weight. I took a deep breath, pulled out a manila folder, and placed them inside. Labeling it felt strange, like I was starting something bigger than I could yet name, but I did it anyway. Asterisk March records. Asterisk. Then I wrote the date by hand, deliberate, and sealed the folder shut with a paperclip. No one had ever taught me how to prepare for betrayal. Not in school, not in life, but after years of shelving books and sorting facts, I knew one thing: keep the originals. Make copies, hide them somewhere quiet, and never ever assume that anyone else is watching out for you. I made photocopies of both documents and stored them in a separate drawer beneath my winter linens. I hadn't touched those in months. No one would think to look there. As I moved through the house, I looked at things differently. Every drawer, every file, every letter from the insurance company now felt like potential evidence. I wasn't paranoid. I was finally paying attention. They had counted on my silence, on my politeness, on the way older women disappear in plain sight. But I had spent my life surrounded by people's secrets in ink and handwriting and overdue slips no one wanted to admit to. And if I was going to be reduced to a case file or a signature, I'd make sure the record reflected the truth. I walked into the spare bedroom, once Craig's room, now mostly storage. Inside the closet, I reached for an old metal lockbox. It still had my father's initials etched faintly on the lid. I placed the folder inside, closed it gently, and turned the key. I stood there for a while, hand on the lid. Not victorious, not vengeful, just aware. There were things I didn't understand yet, motives I hadn't pieced together, but the pattern had started to emerge, and once you see the pattern, you can't pretend it's not there. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea gone cold and stared out at the street lamp flickering across the road. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew I wouldn't be caught sleeping again. The auditorium was warm, too. Warm like they'd cranked the heat too high and forgotten about it. I sat in the third row, clutching the printed program with both hands. Student Excellence Awards, Cedar Falls Elementary. Milo's name was circled in pencil. Rows of metal chairs creaked as parents shifted. The faint scent of old floor wax mixed with buttered popcorn from the concession table in the hallway. On stage, children fidgeted in button-up shirts and wrinkled khakis. I hadn't planned on coming. The invitation arrived late-handed to me by Milo himself, tucked inside his math folder. No note from Craig, no text from Brenna, but I came anyway, because he asked. I watched Milo step onto the stage, small shoulders, squared cheeks pink from nerves. He clutched his certificate, turned toward the crowd, and smiled. My heart softened. He was so much like Craig had been at that age. Kind shy, always looking for someone in the crowd. And today he found me. He waved quick, nervous, then looked over at Craig and Brenna, seated on the other side of the aisle. And that's when it happened. A woman I didn't know leaned over toward Brenna and whispered something. She must have asked who I was. Brenna laughed, loud enough for half the row to hear. "Oh, that's just the nanny," she said. My breath caught. She didn't correct herself, didn't glance at me, just smiled, nodded toward Milo like it was all a joke. Craig didn't say a word. He stared ahead at the stage as if he hadn't heard. I sat still. The program folded tightly in my hands, now crinkling at the edges. Heat rushed to my face, but I forced my spine straight. Nanny, after everything. After every scraped knee, I kissed every night. I stayed up during fevers, every lunch packed, when Brenna forgot this was what I'd been reduced to. Not even a name. Not even a role. Just background. The applause picked up as the final names were called. Milo stepped down. I stood, not because I wanted to, but because I needed air. Outside the evening had cooled. The wind cut clean across the school parking lot, and I welcomed it. Let it sting. I heard footsteps behind me. Milo wants a photo, Craig said flatly. Come back in for a second? I turned slowly, with the nanny. His mouth twitched, guilt maybe, but he said nothing. I'm fine here, I said. You go ahead. He didn't insist, just nodded once and walked away. I leaned against the railing, hands gripping the cold metal. Let them pose. Let them smile. Let them pretend the woman who tucked him in for 10 years no longer exists, because I was still here, and I had seen more than they knew. Let them forget. I wouldn't. The porch light flickered as I stepped inside. I didn't take off my coat, didn't turn on the kitchen light. I just walked to the chair near the window and sat, hands resting on my knees, still gloved. The silence in the house didn't feel comforting tonight. It felt like someone had folded it tightly and left no air inside. I replayed her voice in my head. That's just the nanny. It echoed sharper in the dark. I let the hurt wash over me. Let it roll through every part of me that still expected better. Then I breathed. Once. Twice. Judy's voice came back next. A memory quiet but unshakable. Justice isn't loud, she once told me, sipping tea in the backyard. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs receipts and patience. Receipts and patience. That was the way Judy operated. A woman who once took down a crooked city contractor using nothing but notarized blueprints and a letter opener. She never raised her voice. She just waited for the paper trail to scream on her behalf. I got up, unwrapped my scarf, and placed it slowly on the hook by the door. I reached into the side pocket of my coat and pulled out the program from the ceremony, now wrinkled and warm. On the back was a short note from one of the teachers. Asterisk, Milo has been doing well, just a few reminders not to speak out of turn during group activities. Asterisk. I read the sentence again. Not to speak out of turn. The words tightened around something in my chest. Had someone told him to be quiet? Had someone warned him not to say anything about the plate about me? I thought back to his eyes the night he screamed. How they darted from Brenna to Craig, how he looked torn, like he was breaking some secret code just by opening his mouth. And then, the picture. The red X over my plate, the woman slumped next to me. He'd drawn what he couldn't say. Because maybe, just maybe, someone told him not to talk about it. I sat down again and opened the drawer beside the armchair. Inside the folder I had started was waiting March. Records still thin but growing. I added the teacher's note. Not because it was proof of anything on its own, but because patterns rarely reveal themselves all at once. You have to lay them side by side. You have to watch them echo. I opened a second folder, blank for now, and wrote one word on the tab. Milo. I didn't know what I'd fill it with yet, but I knew I would, because if they were willing to rewrite who I was, they might be rewriting who he's allowed to become. And I would not let that happen. Not again. Not quietly. The library still smelled like paper and time. Not the sharp, artificial scent of new books, but the warm, lived-in smell of pages handled for decades. Dust glue would polish the scent of memory. I stepped through the side entrance, the one employees used, and paused at the threshold. For a moment, it felt like I had never left. Same creak in the fourth floorboard. Same soft hum from the vent above the check-in counter. Joanne was at the front desk. She looked up and blinked. Evelyn? Her voice rose in quiet surprise. It's been a while. I smiled gently. It has. I'm just looking for something. In the local records room. She hesitated, then nodded. Of course. You know the way. I did. The stairs creaked louder than I remembered. My knees protested more than they used to. But the motion felt right. Familiar. Like putting on an old coat that still carried your shape. The local records room sat at the end of the second-floor corridor, behind a heavy oak door with a brass knob that always stuck. I gave it a firm twist. Inside, it was cold. The windows were thin, the insulation poorer than the rest of the building. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, and the low yellow ceiling light cast a hush over everything. I walked to the cabinet marked Private Legal Holdings, letters and documents. Top drawer. My fingers paused at the label. Polk, Greaves, Huxley, asterisk. It was still there. I pulled the drawer open slowly. A thin manila envelope rested near the back, labeled in Judy's script asterisk. For Evelyn Polk, filed 2019 witness JG asterisk. JG. Judy Greaves. My throat tightened. I slid it out gently and opened it. Inside a notarized letter, 3 pages dated 6 months before Judy's stroke. She had transferred oversight of a modest trust, approximately $80,000 into Evelyn's name, not as inheritance, but as a protective measure. The letter explicitly stated that should Evelyn's legal control over her own assets ever come under question, this trust would remain separate, untouchable by family, without her written consent. I sat down in the narrow reading chair, heart thudding. I had forgotten. Or maybe I'd buried it. Judy had told me over coffee once I filed a copy where no one can edit it. I thought she meant the safe at her house. But she hadn't trusted houses, or even family. She trusted records. I flipped through the final page. There it was. Her signature. A witness line. The notary seal. Stamped. Permanent. My hands trembled, but I didn't drop the paper. I folded the pages carefully, returned them to the envelope, and tucked it inside my coat. Then I sat for another minute, listening, not to sound, but to certainty. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't confused. I had just been underestimated. And that was their mistake. Back home, I spread the envelope on the kitchen table. The light overhead flickered slightly, casting soft shadows across the wood grain. I opened the flap once more and slid the pages out slowly, my hands careful, deliberate. No rush. These things deserve to be handled like bone china, fragile but strong in the right places. I made 2 copies, one for the safe box, one to keep on hand. The old printer in my hall closet groaned as it came to life, struggling through the thick legal paper. I waited, listening to each page fall into the tray with a quiet finality. Afterward, I returned the original to the manila envelope and sealed it with fresh tape. I labeled the front, asterisk trust filed original, Judy Greaves, E. Polk, 2019, asterisk. Then I took a second envelope and placed 1 copy inside, locking it in my father's metal box beneath the winter linens. The third copy that I slid beneath the kitchen drawer, lining just beneath the old birthday candles I hadn't used in years. Then I sat. I stared at the final copy on the table. I didn't need to read it again. What I needed was to remember what else I had forgotten. I opened my laptop and pulled up my old email. I hadn't used that account in months, maybe a year. The inbox was dusty. Newsletters, event reminders, some notes from old patrons. Then I saw it. Subject: access to legal deposit, Judy Greaves asterisk, from Craig Polk, date November 2022, asterisk. My breath hitched. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. He'd asked casually, said he was helping me organize my tax files and needed to verify something Judy had mentioned years ago. I'd forwarded his request to Joanne with my blessing. But now I saw it for what it was. He had known. He had searched for the very thing I'd just retrieved, but he hadn't found it, not through official channels. Because Judy hadn't told anyone where she filed the final version. Except me. And I had forgotten. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to remember. Until now. I clicked open the email thread. Craig's tone was polite, respectful, full of plausible reasons and soft language. But Judy had warned me once. Sometimes the kindest voices carry the sharpest knives. I printed that email too, highlighted the timestamp, added it to the folder marked March Records. Then I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window. The street outside was quiet. No wind, no passing cars, just stillness. But I felt motion inside me. Not fear, not sorrow. Resolve. They had gone through my bank, my medicine, my grandson, and now I knew without doubt that they had tried to erase even what Judy left behind. But they failed, because the record still stood, and I had it now. Safely in my hands, and I would not forget again. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I lay in bed with the covers pulled to my chin, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows in slow, steady waves. The street lamp across the road flickered once, then held steady. 2:14 a.m. Sleep wasn't coming. I pushed the blanket aside and sat up. The floor was cold under my feet. I didn't bother with slippers. I moved through the hallway quietly, more out of habit than necessity. No one else lived here. No one else was listening. In the kitchen, I turned on the stovetop kettle, not for the tea but for the ritual, the sound, the pause between breaths. I didn't sit. Instead, I leaned against the counter and stared at the window, watching my own reflection look back at me, older, yes, but still here. The kettle hissed faintly. I thought of Harold. The last week of his life, we sat right here. He could barely keep his eyes open, but his voice had been clear. "They'll try," he had whispered, gripping my hand. "When I'm gone, they'll try to tell you what's best." I'd laugh gently. "Who's they?" "Anyone who's never had to build from nothing," he replied. "Anyone who calls your sacrifices complications." Then he had squeezed my fingers tighter. "Don't let anyone decide for you." That was 8 years ago. But tonight it felt as fresh as steam from the kettle. I poured the water into a cup, let the tea bag drift, and sat at the table. There was no sound but the quiet tap of water settling in porcelain. I glanced toward the locked drawer beneath the linens, the folders, the papers, the copy of Judy's trust letter, the prescription file, the email, all of it. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was a map, and I was starting to see where it led. I closed my eyes and inhaled. Not deeply, just enough to steady myself. They had expected me to forget, to second guess, to slip. But tonight I saw more clearly than I had in weeks. This wasn't about a single betrayal. It was about slow erasure. One careful step at a time, financial, legal, personal, until I no longer trusted my own memory. Until I asked permission to exist. But I wouldn't. Not now. Because Harold was right. Because Judy was right. Because somewhere inside this quiet, soft-walled woman, they thought they knew there was still a spine. Still a sharp edge where it counted. And come morning, I'd stop keeping quiet. The sun was barely up when I began. The house was quiet, still caught in the blue hush of early morning. I brewed coffee this time, not tea. Something stronger. I needed the smell, dark roast, and bitter courage. At the kitchen table, I laid everything out in rows. The folder labeled March Records. The copy of Judy's notarized trust letter. The pharmacy printout. The email Craig sent the library. Milo's drawings still folded gently. One by one, I numbered them. Not just by date, but by impact. Because order wasn't about time anymore. It was about intention. What they took. What they forged. What they wanted me to doubt. I slid each document into a plastic sleeve, then into a new binder I'd found in Craig's old room, ironic maybe, but fitting. The pages clicked into place with a soft, satisfying sound. Next, I opened a fresh notebook, blue-lined, no margins. On the first page, I wrote, "The 2nd of April 2024, 6:12 a.m., asterisk, I remember everything, asterisk." Then I began to write, not long entries, just the essentials. Who I spoke to, what they said, what I saw, what I felt, even the temperature of the room, even the color of the sky. Because memory fades under pressure, but ink doesn't. When I finished the first page, I stared at it for a long time. This was my voice untouched, my reality unedited, and if they ever tried to claim confusion, I'd have a record. I flipped to the back of the notebook and tore out a page. On it I listed names I hadn't spoken in years. Neighbors, former colleagues, a friend from book club, and at the bottom circled twice, Teresa Maldonado, family law, elder rights attorney, asterisk. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. She moved to Des Moines after her husband passed. But she always said, if you ever need someone who doesn't flinch at silence, call me. I found her number buried in my old address book tucked inside a kitchen drawer beneath expired coupons and a broken tape measure. I traced her name with my fingertip before closing the book again. Not yet, but soon. I placed the binder and notebook inside my old library tote, the one with frayed edges and faded text that read, "Knowledge is quiet power, asterisk." Then I made breakfast. Toast. 1 egg. No radio. Just the gentle sound of the skillet warming, the light clink of the fork against porcelain. No shakiness. No second guessing. No waiting. They wanted silence. What they would get was documentation. And once I was ready, they would hear me without me ever raising my voice. I waited until just after 9 to make the call. The morning light had settled over the table, soft and yellow like the butter I used to leave out for Sunday toast. The house was quiet but not heavy. Focused, intentional. Teresa answered on the third ring. "Evelyn Polk," she said before I even spoke. He smiled. "Still keeping your caller ID sharp. I haven't changed phones since 2015. What's sharper is my memory." We hadn't spoken in 10 years, maybe more. But some voices didn't fade. They just waited. "I need advice," I said simply. There was a pause. Then a low hum, the sound she always made when switching from friend to attorney. "Tell me everything." I did. Not every detail, not yet, but enough. The trust, the forged signature, the sedative, the email. She didn't interrupt once, just let me speak. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "You're not crazy," she said. "You're being dismantled." I swallowed. The word settled like a pebble in a still pond. Dismantled. What do I do? You start by severing every lever they can pull, quietly. That afternoon I went to the bank. Lisa was there again. Her expression changed the moment she saw me. "I need to close the joint account," I told her. "Immediately." She nodded. "We've flagged it since your last visit. I'll begin the process." I handed her my ID, my social security card, and a form Teresa had emailed me that morning. Within 20 minutes, the account was dissolved. The remaining balance, less than I expected, was transferred to a new account in my name only. "No shared access?" Lisa asked. "None," I said. "And please, no one is to be notified this happened." She looked me in the eye. "It never left this desk." Afterward, I walked 2 blocks to the post office and picked up a private P.O. box. Then to the credit union, where I opened a second account, unlinked, unlisted. Just in case. By late afternoon, my financial presence had shifted. Not vanished, but moved like a woman changing her locks while the rest of the house stayed the same. No one had called. No one had noticed. And that was the power of quiet. Back home, I folded the receipts and tucked them into the binder. A new divider labeled Phase 1, Severance, asterisk. I sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea. It wasn't fear I felt. Not anymore. It was space. The first real breath in weeks. I thought of Milo, his drawing his eyes that night. If I couldn't stop everything, at least I could leave him a record. A map. Something to tell him, "Your grandmother knew, and she didn't disappear." Asterisk. The small digital recorder I bought arrived 2 days later. It fit neatly in my palm, slim black, no flashing lights. I tested it once in the living room, reading aloud the first paragraph of the newspaper. Playback was clean, crisp. I labeled a folder on my computer, Conversations, Personal Archive, then locked it behind a password. No one knew but me. That week I let the phone ring twice before answering. I kept my voice steady. I let them speak first. Craig called on Thursday. "Hey, Mom," he said casually. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I answered. He hesitated. "I just wanted to check in." "That's kind of you." Another pause. then. Have you looked into long-term care plans? I sent over a few links. My eyes didn't leave the recorder blinking quietly on the kitchen counter. I'm managing just fine. Of course, he said. Too quick. Just keeping options open. Click. Save. That night I labeled the file, Craig, 04_04, call, long-term care, MP3 asterisk. I played it once. Not for the content, but for the tone. There's something about how a person speaks when they think no one is keeping record. Brenna's voice came next on speakerphone while she chatted with Craig in the background. She didn't know I could hear her. I mean, at this point, she said she's just resisting help out of spite. I didn't flinch. Click. Save. Brenna. Cat. Seeks. Background. Help out of spite. MT2Y. Each file grew the folder. Each word formed a trail. But it wasn't until Saturday that Milo said something I couldn't unhear. We sat in the park, just the two of us. He kicked wood chips at his feet, holding a juice box with both hands. Grandma, he said, voice low. Yes, love. He looked up, eyes wide. Can we not talk about the dinner anymore? I turned to him gently. Why not? He bit his lip. Mom said it's not real, that you're just confused. And I might get in trouble if I say things that aren't true. The wind caught my scarf. I tucked it back slowly. I didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds. Let the silence sit between us like a third person. Then I asked softly, do you remember what happened? He nodded. Then you're not saying anything untrue. He didn't reply, just leaned his head against my arm and went quiet. When we got home, I wrote down everything, his exact words, the look on his face, the pause before he spoke. I labeled it all in my notebook under Milo. I didn't record him. Some things you protect differently. That night I copied all my audio files to an encrypted drive and hid it behind the bookshelf in the guest room. Not because I was afraid, because I was almost ready. The storm was coming. And I wanted every raindrop recorded. I set the table for 3. Not dinner, just coffee. No sugar, no plates, just 3 ceramic mugs, plain and centered. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and something faintly burned toast, maybe from this morning. I let the windows stay closed. Let the air hang still. Craig and Brenna arrived 5 minutes late. She wore heels too tall for a house this old. He held a manila folder. Neither hugged me. Thanks for coming, I said softly. Craig nodded, glancing at the mugs. Is this about something specific? I gestured to the table. Have a seat. We sat. I folded my hands. Let them settle. The kitchen clock ticked too loud in the background. Brenna broke first. If this is about Milo. It's not, I said. This is about me. Silence. Craig leaned back, his folder still unopened. I turned to him. Do you remember when you were 12 and I let you help me catalog books at the library? He blinked. Yeah. You labeled everything so precisely. Said the record should outlive the emotion. He smiled faintly, unsure where this was going. I still believe that I said. Then I slid my own folder across the table. Brown, unmarked, but heavier than it looked. Mom, Craig said slowly. What is this? Documentation, I said. Not accusation. Not yet. Brenna crossed her arms. You're being dramatic. He tilted my head. Emmy. Craig opened the folder. The top page, the pharmacy record. Beneath it, the bank withdrawal. Then a printed transcript of the phone call from last week. He didn't turn the next page. Brenna reached over, flipped one, then froze. You recorded us. I recorded the conversations I was present for, I said, legally. Craig's face reddened. Why would you? Because I needed proof, I said quietly. Not feelings, not suspicions. Paper. Brenna shifted in her chair. This is insane. Is it, I asked? Or did you just not expect the librarian to file her own chapter? The room was still. Even the clock seemed to pause between ticks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just sat, hands still folded, watching them process what they thought I'd never know, what they assumed I'd forget. Craig pushed the folder away. This looks worse than it is. I nodded slowly. That's what paper does. It makes the invisible visible. No one spoke. Then I stood, walked to the cabinet, retrieved one more envelope sealed, set it gently on top of the folder. Before we continue, I said you should know this was filed in 2019. Notarized. Judy's name is on it. Craig looked up sharply, and for the first time since all this began, he looked afraid. I unsealed the envelope slowly. The paper inside was cream-colored thick with Judy's signature in deep blue ink at the bottom of every page. I unfolded the letter, placed my finger on the first line, and began to read aloud. Trust document the 14th of March 2019. Filed with Cedar Falls Public Records, witnessed and notarized. Craig didn't move. Brenna shifted in her seat. You're bringing up old papers now. I kept reading. This trust in the amount of $80,000 is to remain fully in Evelyn Polk's name uncontested. It is protected under Clause 14C. In the event of elder coercion, cognitive manipulation, or unauthorized financial oversight by any third-party, family or otherwise, this document affirms Evelyn's full autonomy and legal authority. The air in the room thickened. Brenna leaned forward, voice tight. That money wasn't even mentioned in your version, I said quietly. Craig blinked. What? I met his eyes. The version you tried to find. The one you emailed Joanne about. You never saw this one, because Judy didn't file it at home. She filed it under my name. Brenna's mouth opened, then shut again. I turned to Craig. She told me once, file the truth where they least expect it. File it in silence. Craig looked down. I set the letter on the table right atop the pharmacy printout. Layer after layer, each one small but together undeniable. I didn't accuse. I didn't shout. I just let the facts settle. Brenna's eyes narrowed. You're twisting everything, making it look calculated. I'm not making it look like anything, I replied. I'm just letting it be seen. Craig rubbed his temples. This is getting out of hand. No, I said calmly. This is what happens when the hand that's always been quiet finally turns the page. He looked at me like he didn't recognize who I'd become, but I hadn't changed. I'd just stopped whispering. I walked back to the cabinet, retrieved one last item, a small unopened flash drive. I placed it beside the letter. What's that? Brenna asked. I looked at her. You'll find out, I said. Soon enough. She stood. We should go. Craig didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the flash drive, on the folder, on the woman who had just dismantled every quiet lie they built, with nothing but paper and memory. They left without another word. Craig closed the door behind him softly but not gently. I heard Brenna's heels click down the steps, quick and uneven. A car door slammed, then silence. I stood at the window watching their taillights disappear down the block. Still no shouting. Still no apology. But it didn't matter anymore. I turned back to the table. The folder lay open, its contents slightly shifted from all the movement. I smoothed each page back into place, pressing down gently as if tucking in an old quilt. Then I reached for the envelope from Teresa. It had arrived that morning, slipped under the door by courier. Thick white official. I hadn't opened it yet. Now I did. The first page was a letter on firm stationery. Evelyn, per our conversation, the trust documentation has been reviewed and secured. We've initiated steps to transfer title protection under revised elder autonomy provisions. You retain full control. No other party, including next of kin, can act on your behalf without notarized consent. I read the paragraph twice. Then once more. The tension in my shoulders eased only slightly. Not a release, just the first breath, after too long holding it. Behind the letter there was a set of forms, signatures marked with yellow tabs. Teresa's handwriting in the margins. Done. Filed. Yours. Asterisk. I slid everything back into the envelope and placed it in the center of the table. Then I rose. Walked to the hallway. Unlocked the storage cabinet. Inside the binders were neatly stacked March records, Milo financial audio logs. I added a new one. Final confirmations. Asterisk. Filed Teresa's envelope behind it. Shut the cabinet. Turned the key. Slid it into my pocket. There was no rush. No urgency. Just completion. I made tea. Not to calm down, just to mark the moment. The kettle steamed. The cup warmed my fingers. I sat by the window. Same chair, same angle. Outside, the late spring sun dipped behind the neighbor's pine tree, casting long lines of light across my kitchen floor. It felt like the room could breathe again. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. But somewhere between the second and third sip, I caught my reflection in the window glass. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't disappeared. It had been 12 days. No phone calls, no text messages, no surprise knocks at the door. Silence, but not the kind that used to throb in the middle of the night. This silence had edges, shape, room to breathe. I swept the porch slowly, letting the bristles drag across the uneven wood. The pine needles collected in small piles, dry, sharp, fragrant, the kind Harold used to curse every spring. I remembered him crouched by the steps, swatting at the wind with a plastic rake, cursing the tree he'd planted, laughing when I told him we should have just paved the whole yard. Now the wind blew unchallenged, and I didn't mind. Inside, the house felt still, not frozen, not heavy, just still. I'd polished the kitchen floor 2 days ago, not because it was dirty, but because I wanted the scent of lemon oil again. I'd rearranged the spice rack, alphabetically cumin beside curry paprika last. No one would notice, but I would. The binder sat untouched in the cabinet drawer. March records, Milo, financial, audio logs, Judy. I didn't need to open them. I knew what they held. I knew what I had done. The kettle clicked softly. I hadn't turned the spout, so no whistle, just a puff of steam curling like breath into the kitchen air. I poured a mug, held it in both hands, and walked to the window. My chair welcomed me without a sound. The cushion still carried the shape of my back. Outside, the light shifted, long, soft lines across the fence. The neighbor's dog barked once, then nothing. I read the newspaper front to back, skipped the obituaries, reread the garden column about tulips and fungal rot, thought about planting something, then changed my mind. At noon, the mail slot clattered. Bills, a grocery flyer, and one envelope small and square with no return address. The handwriting was crooked, hesitant, inside a folded note. Short, no salutation, no signature. Asterisk, I know you didn't do anything wrong. Mom says a lot of things, but Milo's been better since that day. He doesn't flinch anymore. Thank you for protecting him. Asterisk. I read it again. Then again. I recognized the hand. Marissa. 12 years old and already braver than some adults I knew. I pressed the paper flat against the table, smoothing every fold. Then I walked to the shelf and opened my recipe book. The old one, grease-stained dog-eared, held together by years of flour and memory. I tucked the note between cornbread and chicken salad, where sweetness met salt. Then I closed the book and held it to my chest. She hadn't said much, but she'd said enough. The sun moved a little higher. I let it warm the floor. I stepped outside barefoot. The stone path was cool under my feet. I wandered toward the lilac bush, its scent already floating through the yard in soft purple waves. I reached out and touched one bloom, delicate, but certain, like truth whispered just loud enough to hear. I stayed there for a long time, not thinking, not planning, just being. And when I turned to go back inside, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, softer, still here, and for the first time in weeks I smiled, not wide, not brave, just real. Because healing didn't announce itself. It arrived in small envelopes. The room still smelled like old notebooks and aftershave. Craig's room. I hadn't been in here in months, not really. I'd passed by with laundry. I'd dusted the windowsill, but I hadn't looked. Now I opened the door fully and stepped in. The light was soft. Afternoon sun filtered through the faded curtains, casting pale squares on the floor. The bookshelf leaned slightly to the left, still filled with worn paperbacks, baseball trophies, and an old flashlight that hadn't worked since 2002. I took a breath. Then I got to work. I started with the bed, removed the blanket, folded the sheet, took off the old pillowcase and placed it in the laundry. I pulled the mattress off the frame and leaned it against the wall. The floor creaked as I moved, but not in protest. More like memory. I opened the closet. A few shirts still hung there. A pair of sneakers sat in the corner, one lace missing. I placed them in a box along with the clothes, the trophies, the flashlight. Nothing was thrown away, but everything found a new place. By late afternoon, the room was empty. Clean. I brought in the small armchair from the living room, faded green velvet, the one Milo always curled into when he visited. Set it in the corner by the window. I added a floor lamp, a basket of blankets, a low shelf with picture books, some classics, a few mysteries. I stacked a few drawing pads, a tin of colored pencils, tucked a notebook into the side. Then I stood back and looked. Not a child's room, not a museum, just a space, quiet, safe. A place to read, to think, to belong. The doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked slowly down the hall. Ruth stood on the porch, balancing a warm plate of lemon bars in one hand and her cane in the other. "Thought you might need something sweet," she said. I smiled. "You read my mind." She stepped inside carefully. Her eyes scanned the hallway, the clean table, the quiet air. Over tea, we talked about lilacs, about the neighbor's new mailbox, about how the grocery store had stopped carrying her favorite marmalade. Then, just before she stood to leave, she glanced toward the hallway. "Is your nephew still coming?" she asked, voice low. I didn't answer right away. I thought of the drawing, the red X, the eyes that looked for permission to speak. I thought of the note from Marissa, of the room upstairs now filled with light and quiet books. Then I nodded. "He knows the way." She smiled. "Good. I had a feeling." After she left, I stood at the window and watched her walk slowly across the street. The sun was beginning to dip. And in that golden hush, with lemons still on my tongue and blankets folded just right upstairs, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Steady. Not because everything was fixed, but because I was, and that was enough. It was a Tuesday. No holiday, no birthday, just a quiet spring day that smelled faintly of cut grass and mail paper. I was dusting the shelves when I heard the soft knock. Not the doorbell, just 3 careful taps. When I opened the door, he was there. Milo. Hands tucked in the pockets of his hoodie, backpack slung low, hair slightly damp from biking too fast. He didn't speak. I didn't ask. I stepped aside and he walked in. His shoes squeaked on the floor as he moved toward the hallway. His head turned just a glance toward the room that used to be his father's. He paused, then pushed the door open. I stood at the end of the hall watching. He looked around, slowly, took in the chair, the books, the pencils, the small lamp I'd left on that morning without knowing why. He walked in, closed the door behind him gently. No slam. I returned to the kitchen, put the kettle on, though I didn't know if he wanted tea. Set out 2 cups just in case. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. I didn't go up. When I finally did, I didn't knock. The door was slightly ajar. I peeked in. Milo was sitting in the green chair, legs curled beneath him, a mystery novel in his lap. Not reading fast, just turning pages with both hands as if anchoring them. He didn't look up when I stepped in. I didn't speak. I walked over quietly, sat on the edge of the old toy chest, and just watched him for a moment. The room smelled like wood polish and pencil shavings. Light from the window caught the edge of his cheek. I reached out and placed my hand gently over his. He didn't pull away. He didn't say a word. But he let it stay. And in that small, unspoken moment between paper and skin, between silence and breath, I felt it settle. Note forgiveness, note answers, just presence. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with music or closure. Sometimes it just shows up at your door, on a Tuesday. The house was still again. Milo had left hours ago, the mystery novel tucked into his bag without a word. He hadn't said goodbye, just looked at me, nodded once, and pedaled off into the afternoon sun. I didn't follow him to the porch. I trusted the silence. Now I sat at the kitchen table with a blank page in front of me. The same notebook I'd used for records and dates and details. But this page was different. No headings, no timestamps, just space. I picked up the pen, let it hover, then began. Dear Evelyn asterisk, you did not imagine it, you did not exaggerate, you did not make it harder than it was. Asterisk, you waited, you watched, you remembered. Asterisk, you did not scream, you did not vanish, you did not ask for permission. Asterisk, you kept your voice, that's enough. Asterisk. I stopped. That was it. I tore the page carefully along the spiral, folded it once, and slid it into the back pocket of my coat. Not to save it, just to carry it a little while longer. Outside, the light had turned golden, the kind of light that drapes across sidewalks and makes everything look softer. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my scarf, and stepped out the front door. No plan, no errand, just motion. The sidewalk was cracked in familiar places. A squirrel darted past me tail high. The wind smelled of soil like rain had passed through earlier when I wasn't looking. I walked 2 blocks, then 3. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched longer. At one corner, I paused beneath the old maple tree, the one that had dropped leaves into my mailbox every October for as long as I could remember. A single leaf floated down, now twirling once before landing near my foot. I didn't pick it up. I just watched it settle, then turned, and walked home. No finish line, no applause, but with every step less weight, and that too was healing.